Hi, and welcome to today's episode of the India at Harvard podcast, where we bring some of the best Harvard affiliates, researchers, students, alumni of Harvard University to come and talk about various aspects of India's development journey. And today I'm especially delighted and proud and privileged to have with us CV Madhukar, someone who has been an influential figure for my own Harvard journey, both while I was at Harvard and since, who served as a mentor also in many ways and a friend for many years now, and has done some incredible work, built some great institutions, including first PRS, legislative research, which really transformed how members of parliament in India did and were assisted by young professionals in the work and the research they could do to inform their work in parliament. And more recently, co-develop, an institution that Madhukar has again founded, which is really mobilizing DPI, digital public infrastructure, that India's succeeded in over the last few years, but really trying to take that DPI journey globally for other institutions and countries globally. And really welcome Madhukar to the India at Harvard podcast. I'm looking forward, Priyanka and I, we're both looking forward to this conversation with you.
Welcome. Thank you, Anirudh. That was a generous introduction. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
No, hardly. I know I've only mentioned a couple of things, but I know you've done a great amount of work, especially institutionally, to transform, I think, India's development journey. So it was hardly generous, but thank you for all the work you've done, and I think for all the Harvard alums you've mentored along the way as well. But let's get started on our conversation today with a broad question, Madhukar, about your current avatar, which is heading co-develop. Tell us, for those who are not familiar, what large problems are you trying to solve, both at co-develop and I think the other partner institutions that you've worked with over the years in the field of digital public infrastructure? What problems are you trying to solve?
Thank you for having me, Priyanka and Anirudh. The question is a great starting point to even to debate and discuss what is digital public infrastructure, perhaps, and maybe build on your question. The idea that we the lessons we've learned from a brick and mortar economy basically tells us that once you set up infrastructure that the economy can use, both governments and the private sector, that lead to a lot of economic growth and opportunity for a lot of people. And what we've done in the brick and mortar economy is set up infrastructure, which is public infrastructure, a lot of it, roads, airports, ports, and so on. And that has led to a lot of economic activity and growth. But in the digital space, we've forgotten that lesson of shared infrastructure between the public and the private sector. And so, what we've had is two distinct streams of infrastructure being built. One part is focused on government services and so on, and they call it e government or GovTech or digital government and so on and so forth. And on the other, you have private sector entities, both Indian corporations and globally, building out infrastructure which is private and walled gardens that they will not allow anyone else to use or play on. Right. And I think what we're trying to do with digital public infrastructure is to bring the idea of shared assets for the economy as a central piece as to how you think about digital economy. Because as we look at the next century, we'll be a fully digital economy in some years. So what are those core layers of infrastructure that can help us leapfrog into the new digital century and make it more equitable, egalitarian, and useful for everybody, right? That's the promise we're trying to get behind and see what we can do in co-develop and beyond.
And is there a reason why you think that the private sector, which is typically built out tech infrastructure, right? If you look at the last 20, 30 years of whether it was the consumer internet wave or even prior to that, why is it that you feel in the current scenario it's important for the private sector to not be the only player that builds out this digital infrastructure, and why we need this kind of shared model as you've described it?
Yeah, this is an important question because there is a misconception that somehow digital public infrastructure means government run, government built, government controlled. I'll give you the example of, again, from our brick and mortar economy, electricity, for instance, or telephones. Now, these are public infrastructure, but almost universally both provisioned and provided for by the private sector. But there is something about this that makes this public infrastructure, right? What we've lost in the digital economy is to figure out what that publicness looks like. So one of the pieces of work we've commissioned and have a paper out from Mariana Mazzucato and David Eves at University College London is this precisely this question of what is public and digital public infrastructure. It doesn't mean government controlled, government owned, but really what are the guardrails on governance that makes something public or not. And I think the nature of public is then it's non-excludable. Everybody can build on it. Everybody can use it. Now, as long as the private sector is willing to allow that on an equitable ground, that's okay. The complication with digital is that if you have a private player in who then amasses all of the data that comes through providing infrastructure, that makes that particular provider of that information and platform supremely powerful because of network effects. So there's a slight distinction between physical infrastructure. When you can have as many cars going on roads as possible, there's not an aggregation of data that then leads to, right? But in digital, that's somewhat different. And so it's a little bit more complicated than physical infrastructure. But the essence is, I think one of the things I want to remind ourselves is the first layer of digital public infrastructure came from America, which is the internet, right? It was publicly funded. It came up in universities, and now it's actually available to the rest of the world as a public good. And we pay for it. It's not free, but we pay for the services that we want. I'll give you another example, which is actually free for us, for all of us, fully funded by the American taxpayer, which is the GPS. GPS, again, was built to basically aim missiles into Russia. And then Clinton, before he demitted office after the second term, made this as a public asset. And now this is actually fully funded by the US taxpayer and is free for the rest of the world. That's the quality of public infrastructure that America built out. But in the last 25 years, we've only seen walled gardens come up. And that's a bit of a disappointment given the legacy that America brought to this journey to see more walled gardens become the norm. In fact, become anything, it's gone to a stage where anything, when you say public, there's a pushback saying, oh my God, keep government out. But what I'd want to say is the people who are saying keep government out today for digital infrastructure have a voice because the internet and GPS were public infrastructure. They should remember that. And so the question is not whether it should be public or private, what model of governance should we have so that everybody can benefit and you don't create walled gardens like we have in the past 25 years. That's the question for us.
Madhukar, during G20, India really started advocating for DPI, right, versus these traditional digitization, siloed approaches. So you kind of unpacked a bit about what the public is in digital public infrastructure. Tell us a little bit on the technical side. What are the shared assets in the public? And what sort of are the core layers of infrastructure in the DPI approach versus like a siloed traditional digitization approach?
Sure. See, the systems, government digitization has been going on for like 3, 4 decades across the world, right? And typically, governments are structured in silos, ministries or agencies, and so on. And so, if you look back, every time a government wanted to automate a certain business process, they would get a budget, a line item, and somebody in charge of solving that problem. So what they would do is they'd do an RFP, get a vendor, build out a solution. And then 6 months later, the same agency had some more money to digitize another business process. So another RFP, another vendor, another solution. And if you actually take this across ministries and agencies in the government, because how budgets are provided in these cases, everything is a new silo. So it's not quite that people are stupid, it's just how government was structured. And so that has become the default in how we build digital. Now, if you take let's say America or India, which has 10,000 municipalities. Right? In America, every municipality would do its own, RFP, its own vendor, and build out a new solution. Now, how many variants could you possibly have in collecting property taxes? Right? Why do you need a new RFP, a new vendor, a new solution in every municipality? That's a very simple question. Could we not have, for instance, reusable assets that are core and actually adapt that to my municipality as opposed to doing my own RFP and tender and all of that process, right? When you're replicating or duplicating all of these assets over and over again in these 10,000 municipalities, you're actually spending public taxpayer money very, very poorly, right? And so the argument we're making is, can we think of reusable assets that you can take across? The advantage of the digital is this is, in economic terms, a public good. It is something that can be reused. It doesn't, if you use it, I don't have to lose the value of all of this. You can actually take this across the board, across countries, across states, across cities, and still make it more useful, as opposed to rebuilding this every time. So there's a legacy reason why this was rebuilt and rebuilt and rebuilt. But now at co-develop, we are working with a number of institutions such as multilateral development banks, the World Bank, IDB, ADB, and so on, but also the UN system, to say, look, duplicating the stuff every time, especially in the time of aid cuts that we are today, will make it a lot harder for countries. And you're basically, because of legacy models of how the World Bank or others are funding project finance, stuff like power plants and roads and so on, where you have to rebuild it every time. You're taking the same model to digitization, and actually, resulting in more debt to countries and bad outcomes for countries. We are actually requesting and engaging with these institutions to say, what are the alternative models that you can think about how you finance this stuff, which then incentivizes behavior and outcomes for countries. That's been a big push for us.
That's very useful. And I think a strong case, right, being
Yeah.
made for the DPI approach versus sort of what we've been doing so far in a siloed approach. So, Madhukar, I mean, during G20, when India started advocating the DPI approach, sort of what are the key enablers that countries need to have, technical and non technical? Please take us to sort of the core infrastructure, but also the governance, the policy side. What do these countries in emerging markets that India is advocating DPI for? What do they need to start with?
Yeah. The G20 year for India was actually a very important year for DPI, right? Because India had, as you know, spent the last 15 years building out Aadhaar and UPI and many other layers of infrastructure. And I would argue, I'm super proud of what we've done in India. And I would argue that we probably have developed so many capabilities over these 15 years that we actually are a role model for the rest of the world, developing country or not. I would think it's equally important for America to save its taxpayers' money as it is for Nigeria or for India or for China or for whatever country it is, right? But the model is extremely important. How do you create shareable, reusable assets that are used across the economy? I think that's the core point. And the G20 government of India made it a central theme because that was one of the unique things that India had to offer. And I was engaging with the government on the digital economy working group as the meetings went on. And I recall in the very first meeting of the digital economy working group, countries were saying, what is DPI? By the third meeting, the discussion was down to, okay, there are one or two countries that are still holding out, and we don't have a consensus statement. Can we start drafting a consensus statement on what DPI should look like? And I think by the end of it, the fourth meeting, we actually had a draft consensus statement, and I signed up by all the members of the G20. I think we made a lot of progress. So what that did was it elevated the idea of DPI around the world. Now it's now just 2 years since we finished with our own G20 presidency, but G20 is everywhere. In fact, we keep wondering if we are going through a hype cycle on DPI, because what's happening right now is
Mm.
whatever governments are doing with digital and technology, they're calling DPI, right?
Right,
And we're saying
right.
no, that's not necessarily DPI. It's GovTech, it is e-government, it is digital government, all of that. DPI essentially means that someone else can build on top of the layer that you have built. That is DPI. So you build roads, somebody puts in the cars and buses. You build ports, somebody else runs the ships. So if you can't build a layer that others can build on, it's not quite DPI, right? It's
So
just
that's the
DPI.
public, you're saying, right? That it's the public has to build on this core
Yeah,
infrastructure.
it's the people to have, because if you're doing a full stack solution, then it's a solution. It's not DPI. So I think the distinction is important and is quite lost in the broader rhetoric and so on. Yeah, I think the idea of digital public infrastructure is that if you take any public infrastructure, even the physical public infrastructure we've had so far, right? Government puts out roads, and government uses roads for ambulances, school buses, and so on and so forth. But also private sector, uses the roads. So what is infrastructure is really that you put something out and others leverage it for other economic activity, other social activity. And so in digital, the more we think about what is reusable by others, the idea of digital public infrastructure is lost, because anybody who's building a GovTech solution or a solution to digitize something, they're beginning to call it DPI, and we're trying to. So I think it's part of the hype cycle we're going through, and we need to clarify that sooner than later, because Otherwise, it would become one of those things that everybody greenwashes it, and then it's just all over the place. But we have a window, and I'm optimistic that we can actually drive this discussion over the next 2 to 2.5 years to actually make this work.
Madhukar, the layers that Priyanka also asked you about, can you give us maybe some examples of where you've seen now this idea of DPI actually succeed? DPI, as you define it, succeed, and what layers have maybe some countries that you also work with? What layers have they managed to build, and which part of this stack has been built out more successfully or initially successfully
Yeah.
than maybe others?
Yeah, I think the layers are important, because if you look at the economic activity in countries right now, one of the pieces that we will all need to solve for is identifying each other digitally, authenticating each other digitally. For instance, when we were small communities, we would walk down, the community would know us, and they would know me, and I would know them. But now, as we are getting into transactions with people who we don't see, we need more capability to identify that you are who you are, right? And the traditional means that we've used, for instance, I would point to America. During COVID, the US lost, according to congressional estimates, $87 billion to COVID relief fraud. $87 billion, right? Why did it happen? Mostly it's identity fraud. And so at the same time, as you probably know, India sent out emergency relief to 200 million women's bank accounts for COVID relief and zero fraud. The reason is we had the underlying infrastructure that we could leverage, identify, authenticate the people who were getting it, and people got it. So the idea that we need digital authentication capabilities is almost a given now. It's a matter of how and how quickly we can get it to. Similarly, on digital payments, one of the things that emerged out of the COVID saga was many countries realized they needed capabilities to give money to people quickly when there was an emergency. And that became a large use case that emerged out of COVID, because as I looked at the World Bank and UN and others, when we were setting up co-develop in 2022, what's the big use case? Government to people payment capabilities. That G2P payments was a big deal. So digital payments in some form is an important layer of capability that we need as an economy. And then the question comes of data exchange between government agencies. How do you share data? What data do you share? How do you protect privacy and so on? What's that capability going to look like? Because if it's all in silos, then how do you make this work? Then another layer that has become increasingly important as we generate more data and footprint is, how do I leverage my data for my own empowerment? How do I share data? So for instance, if I'm an Uber driver right now with 5,000 rides and a 4-star rating, if I leave Uber, I've lost all of those credentials. The question I have is, can I carry those credentials with me so that I can get a driver's job by saying, man, I have this kind of rating, I have this kind of experience. But right now, there's no mechanism for us. What's the verifiable credential layer that we need to build that becomes a public asset where I can carry my data with me? And so if you look at economic activity and then look back and say, okay, what kinds of infrastructure can unlock more value on all of these layers? That's what becomes the guiding path for what kind of layers and capabilities do you need to build going forward. Fortunately, we have the answers to how do I connect devices, which is the internet. And we have an answer to the question, where are you, which is the GPS. Now we're trying to build the additional layers that are required for us to be a fully functioning digital economy. And that's the journey we're on right now.
Let's dig deeper into the DPI execution and implementation within India, Madhukar. That of course you have seen, and now you are also actively helping shape. While you've mentioned this sort of shared public-private model, talk to us about how the DPI and the different layers of DPI in India that have been built out, whether on the identity side or the payment side, verification side. Who are the key public and private stakeholders here? Who funds it? Who owns it? What piece does which kind of player own? And the reason why I think this question is even more important, I think very recently I saw China come up in the news where they are saying now that the government own the identity layer instead of any given private sector player. Let the government own that, and then let every private entrepreneur or every private company use that almost government owned ID to verify, identify, and validate you. So talk to us maybe about the India piece first, and then whether what do you think of this Chinese model?
Yeah, I think part of the challenge in all of this digital story is the governance story, right? I want to distinguish the two questions. They're interrelated, but distinguish two questions. One is, who owns the stuff? and the other is who pays for it, right? I want to say there are multiple models that are possible on who owns this stuff. The main important question that we will need to think, especially as people who've been trained at Kennedy School, is who are the winners and losers, and in what model? And so if you take an extreme panopticon view of oh my god, this will lead to some bad stuff, then you're on one side of the spectrum saying the government should have nothing to do with it. On the other hand, if you don't trust the private sector, as in many countries, including in India, private sector trust has been low for a number of decades because of our histories, right? You might say, I'd rather trust the government than with some random private sector company, right? And so it really depends on the context as to where you want to land on the spectrum. There's no one right or wrong answer. In general, given the power that digital assets can have, especially if it's controlled by one entity, government or private, I would say look for guardrails, because this can become potent stuff if it's not guarded properly. And so in this particular case, you mentioned China in this example. Maybe it works for the Chinese economy and how they're structured, but eventually, if there's a more open society, you might want to have different models. On the question of who pays for this, right? I would ask the same question: who pays for roads? Who pays for railroads? Who pays for ports, and who pays for airports? What's that model that exists in the physical economy that we can learn from and adapt to the digital economy? I don't think everything needs to be free in perpetuity. There are models that we are experimenting in India. There are models that other countries are experimenting. As to how much of this depends, what should be free and for how long, depends on the public policy questions you're trying to answer. I'll bring in a particular example of India. The Unified Payments Interface is a payments infrastructure that is quite widely popular in India. And there's a lot of debate going on for the last several years as to whether it should be fully subsidized, because we don't pay any MDR for merchants who accept this money. And card companies have been, feeling they've been left out of this, and, this is not working for them. The question that India might have asked, I'm guessing here, is I want to move to a fully digital payments economy. I want to encourage this because, as a national policy objective, this is my policy objective. And therefore, if I need to subsidize this for some time to come, I will do it. On the other hand, I'm going back to the US because of the context we all have. There's a lot of rhetoric in the US about supporting small businesses, right? And government tries many different policy measures to support small businesses. But one of the things they could have done, they could still do, is what will it take to ensure that the small businesses don't have to pay the 3% revenue tax collected by the card companies today? Because 3% on revenues is a lot on profits, right? Maybe 70% on profits. Depending on your policy objective, you will decide to subsidize things from public funding as long as you think that's the public policy objectives you want. At some point, you might decide in India, for instance, hey, we've achieved the public policy objective of making it universally widely used. Now I want to start charging some amount so that the infrastructure is maintained and upgraded on an ongoing basis. So I would actually go back and ask, what is the public policy outcome that you really want, and align your incentives, expenditure, subsidy, all of that in line with the policy outcomes you want. And that can adapt over time. It doesn't have to be fixed, right? It's not like a one size fits all in this particular case.
In the Indian case, Madhukar, does the government currently own all the infrastructure also through one or other arm?
Yeah, no, you can interpret the India story in different ways. I think it was a deliberate effort to set up the UID as an independent authority. Now, yes, it's a quasi-government authority. It's regulated by the government and monitored by the government, but it's set up as an independent authority and not part of the government machinery directly. The Unified Payments Interface, the Reserve Bank of India, and all of the banks have come together to set up this National Payments Corporation of India as a
Yes.
corporation. And so it's a different structure. But if you want to take an uncharitable view of all of this and say, oh, all of this is controlled by government, you could take that view. But on the other hand, I think there's some nuance there that the government of India has tried to bring in, and might be a model that is working for India at this time. And maybe it'll evolve as time goes on. And I'm not going to say that's the exact model that might be relevant in Europe or America or Africa or wherever. I would say it depends on the country and the context, and you would want to choose both the structure, the governance, and so on, depending on the trust in government as an important factor in all of this. Because there are societies that don't trust government at all. You might want to keep the government out for the foreseeable future. But then, as we've seen, the trust in government keeps changing. across societies. Sometimes it's up, sometimes it's down. So, which is why I'm saying the most important element is clarity in public policy outcomes, and therefore aligning all of the measures you take in line with the public policy outcome you really want.
Madhukar, a lot of us just returned from Sevilla, Spain, where we have this seminal conference on sustainable development. So I'm wondering kind of where does DPI come in as a central tool or approach to meeting the SDG goals? Take us to some examples, maybe like you've talked a lot about government subsidies and payments as well. What about healthcare or education or other SDG goals where DPI could be utilized by countries? Tell us about some of these examples.
Yeah. Yeah, DPI is much misunderstood on so many counts. One of the things that some institutions have said is DPI is ID, payments and data exchange, right?
Mhm.
And so if you reduce that to an artifact centric view of the world, of the DPI world, we've commissioned something called the DPI map, dpimap.org. If you take a look at that, there are 57 countries with ID, and there's 75 countries with payment systems, and about 100 countries with data exchange. But if I look at these countries and say, are these DPI exemplars? They're far from it. The reason is, if you take a very artifact centric view, your focus is just to build the artifact. Unless it's actually used for something, it's useless. And so, what we've realized very early on is we always want to tag infrastructure to a particular use case. What are you doing this for? You build an ID system, what is it for? And are those who are going to use it using it and ready to use this? Right. So I'll give you again an India example because we all understand that quite well, but also relevant for the rest of the world. If you recall, when we were trying to dispense with COVID vaccines to all of the people in the country, and COVID vaccines were short, we came up with this thing called the COVID app, which was I took the shot and I had a QR code on my phone instantaneously. Whereas in the US, for instance, you had to get doctors to write on a piece of paper and sign it, right? The reason why we could do it is because we had the underlying infrastructure. Right? My guess is we probably built it with maybe 3 or 4 engineers in 2 weeks and it scaled to a billion people. And if you had to do this in any sector in the US, in the healthcare sector, for instance, for COVID, it would have taken $1 billion, probably taken a year, and probably covered 25% of the population at the end of the year, right? So the economics of DPI are therefore, in it's mostly anecdotal. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of empirical work to back this, but it's self-evident. I'll give you another example where we're talking to one institution that has funded the many countries at the intersection of digital and agriculture. Right? It turns out that these across these countries, this institution has realized, oh my God, they're building the exact same thing, right? They have a farmer ID, they want a farm registry, they want a crop registry, the same assets. But the way funded is in every country they're doing a technical assistance project, an RFP, a vendor, and a bespoke solution. They've come to us and saying, "Oh my God, there's something problematic here." Which goes back to your civil question. Digitization last year, governments around the world spent about $800 billion on digitization across the world. This is Gartner estimates. Out of that, $145 billion were spent on IT services and software. Right? Roughly, just to give you a sense of the proportion, mature economies, about 35 countries in the world, spend about 88% of that $800 billion. The other 160 countries spend 12% of that money. So, if you want these 160 countries to have the same level of digital maturity as the so called advanced economies, we have no financially feasible path, period. So, the idea of reuse, it is not a novelty anymore.
Mm-hmm.
It is just the only option we have. I think what we are trying to do at Co-Develop is both to demonstrate that this works in many countries. Fortunately, we have some, thanks to great partners that we have who we funded, we have 30 countries implementing something right now. And so we have some street cred when we talk about this, that this is the way to do it. But we're also saying, how can we nudge institutions, both global institutions and funders to these global institutions, to say there's a moral imperative for us to not put countries deeper in debt, especially in times when money is so scarce. And so that is the negotiation we're having right now with these institutions to say, so Seville becomes an important backdrop for all of this. Seville provides a moment when we can re-up this conversation, bring it up to the fore and say, we have a few more years, we need to get this right. And so just the mental models are coming in the way of doing this differently. And I think we need to address that at various levels.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about the innovation that DPI also fosters, right? So, as you mentioned, the idea here is to build the infrastructure that others can come and build on. And that set of others often ends up being private entrepreneurs. In India's case, of course, when it comes to payments infrastructure, we've seen many private players come and build on top, for example. But talk to us, Madhukar, about how you feel that innovation, pace of that innovation can continue to be fast and doesn't end up becoming slower or becoming too controlled by the public sector sometimes, as is often what has happened in the past. And if you feel that it's slowing, what are ways in which that pace of innovation can continue to be kept at a much more faster pace?
Yeah. I'd again go back to policy outcomes that we spoke about a little bit earlier. Countries, for instance, we're working in are trying to build out verifiable credentials as an important layer for their economies. For instance, when in low trust countries, when you take an education certificate to a job interview, a lot of time and money is spent on verifying all of the credentials that you take to this process. It takes days, takes hundreds of dollars. If we can actually drop that price down to bare minimum, it would actually help a lot of private sector entrepreneurs. It will help a lot of job seekers and so on. As an example, today I gave you the Uber example as some time ago, Uber driver example. If I'm able to take my credentials that I've been a good handyman, a good plumber for the last 5.5 years, and I've got 5-star ratings, the ability for me to get a job more easily and more instantly at a less cost for verification right now that the employers have. Can you drop that price? I'll give you an example from India. If you are able to drop the price of onboarding customers doing KYC from, let's say, 200 rupees to 2 rupees, you're able to onboard a lot more people from different economic sections of society. They're too expensive to onboard because the business they would bring in would be so low that you wouldn't want to onboard. So it expands markets, it expands an entrepreneurial opportunity for a lot of people across the board. And so the purpose, again, going back to public policy outcomes, should be to say what can serve public welfare the most, and therefore what set of choices do I need to make in terms of subsidies, in terms of structure, in terms of trust, all of this. And so that will be the driving consideration for a lot of the governments going forward.
But let me dig a bit deeper.
Yeah,
So we've seen a lot of innovation happen in the fintech sector, let's say in India, using the DPI layers we've
yeah,
spoken about.
yeah,
But to Priyanka's earlier question around the SDGs, also let's say in healthcare, education, agriculture, we've not.
yeah,
Right? What's the constraint? What's constraining that? If I was a private entrepreneur today, let's say a fintech private entrepreneur in India versus, let's say, a healthcare or an education private tech entrepreneur, what is my constraint today, binding constraint that's not letting me build as many more innovative apps in the healthcare, education, agriculture space as maybe the fintech entrepreneur has been able to?
yeah. It really goes down to what are the assets that you're making available publicly, right? What assets are you able to make publicly, and what can drive inclusion? For instance, I would argue in the fintech space, having UPI, having the data that comes out of UPI has enabled a lot of innovation to happen. The healthcare sector, so the healthcare providers own all the data. All the data sits with individuals, right? To the extent we have paper copies that are coming out. What can we do to credentialize some of that stuff? And what can we do to provide some of the data as public data with anonymity? I don't think we've made enough innovation on the public layers that can enable innovation and activity to go on. The more we're able to build trust around sharing data anonymously, especially in the age of AI, as we look at, as a lot of AI enthusiasts argue, the age of abundance that's supposed to come. It depends on how much open data and architecture you can create in your DPI so that the data becomes available to be able to train the health data of people of Zambia for Zambia populations, as opposed to take the data of Nebraska and try and lump it on people in Zambia. So local data ecosystems, how do you architect that? Because that becomes the fodder for a lot of the innovation, whether AI or not. Where you take fintechs collect a lot of data, and therefore they're able to. But in the health space, the data sits with big hospitals or with the individual, and there's no intermediary mediating that space in a trusted manner, and therefore innovation is bound to suffer. But I think these are in some ways very context centric. I think it'd be a lot harder in America to have anything that's public and given the healthcare ecosystem. But I can see small wins even in the space. I talked about the agri use case. There's no reason why you need the same agriculture stack in many, many countries duplicating it over and over again. You can actually have a common set of assets that can be repurposed for each country. And the private sector has shown this, right? Certainly in my time, when I was much younger, companies used to build bespoke email. You might remember some of that, right?
Yeah.
They would have bespoke HR systems. They would have bespoke enterprise
Correct.
management, ERP systems, right? And so, what Silicon Valley has done is it has told companies, you're not so unique after all, right? We'll give you assets that are so easy to use and so simple to adapt that if you build your own email system, you would look like you lost it. So the question that we are asking inside the government ecosystem is governments, there's always this, having gone to Kennedy School, you'll know, there's always in the development practitioners, there's always a disclaimer line. We'll talk about an example and then we'll say, oh, but one size doesn't fit all. Otherwise, it'd be blasphemy, right? We sacrilege to not have that sentence. I'm going to argue that in technology, there is one size fits all, right? Obviously, subject to adaptation capability, customization capability, and all of that. But the core capabilities that countries need, that's a 70%, 80% is the same thing, right? There's no need to rebuild that stuff. And that cuts across sectors, agriculture, healthcare. You can adapt it to your context, your systems, and all of that. But 80% of what countries need is really the same thing, right? So one size does fit all.
Madhukar, India has done so good with DPI, role model definitely in the world. You cannot sit in a meeting or read a report, sit at the World Bank or the UN or any government meeting that talks about technology where India is not the sort of leading example. What's left internally in house in India to develop 10 years from now, 15 years from now? Do you think we need more players? Do you think we need deeper innovation across each stack? Is there more to do around policy? Are we looking at more sort of domains like health and agriculture? What do you vision that's left for us to keep sort of developing around DPI?
We've taken 15 years to get to where we are. And I think the journey will have to evolve and continue, mostly in response to the challenges that a digital economy will impose on us. I'll give you an example right now. 5 years ago, we were not talking quite a lot about AI. Right now, AI is so central to the conversation. And so the question that we're asking ourselves in India is, what does publicness look like in AI? What steps will the government have to initiate? Or what steps will the market have to initiate to create a public layer of AI that can enable the kind of innovation and breaking down of prices so that all of this becomes a lot more inclusive. The questions are, how much of this should be managed by government? How much subsidy is required? How much should private sector come in? Where should the private sector come in? I think these are important questions, and this will evolve. There's no fixed permanent answer. And I think for India, as we look along, AI is one part of what we need to do. There are other important questions that are coming up. All said done, apart from Aadhaar, UPI is still at 40% penetration, maybe 50% penetration. There's still 50% of the population that's not touched by UPI. And so this is a long journey. And I don't think we'll have a magical endpoint to any of this stuff. I think it'll evolve and evolve and evolve in response to both societal in necessities and technological innovations. I think that's the combination that will drive this forward.
Madhukar, we have to, as the India at Harvard podcast, we have barely spoken about Harvard. Of course, the one thing binding the three of us together is the Kennedy School experience, the Harvard experience. But talk to us now a little bit about your personal journey. We've spoken a lot about your recent work. I know that when I was a student at Kennedy, I came across you and your work at PRS at the time, and the work that you were doing to really foster a great research ecosystem for parliamentarians as well at the time. Tell us how maybe the Harvard journey has informed even your current work at Co-Develop, how it continues to maybe help you in some of the work now that you're doing the work globally as well. Talk to us about your time at Harvard and how it's shaped your journey since.
For me personally, Harvard was a time of reflection and really getting an international feel for a lot of the questions that I had pondered about in India. And I had a great cohort of colleagues from around the world who really would hold nothing back in terms of exchanging ideas, in terms of sharing what they've learned, in terms of sharing experiences
Debating.
and debating, a lot of debating and disagreeing respectfully for the most part, right? So I think that culture of giving, sharing, innovation, pushing the boundaries, all of those are memories that I take away from my Harvard experience. And not taking no for an answer and saying, for instance, when I was discussing the idea of PRS before setting it up while I was at Harvard, a lot of naysayers, both from India and abroad, say this wouldn't work. I'm saying, what's the worst that'll happen? Let's go try this out. And if it does, it's fantastic. If it doesn't, it's okay. We'll move on and do other things, right? So
Yeah.
just the optimism, in some ways stupid optimism, to go and keep trying to do the right thing. I think that I would give a lot to Harvard.
Yeah.
Madhukar, it's been a pleasure to have you on the podcast. You have been such an important player in DPI in India, and now you are really on the global map talking about the case study of India and really advocating for DPI across developing economies and emerging markets. And as Anirudh said, you've mentored so many at home as well. So thank you for your time today. I think our audience will find this to be very illuminating. We appreciate your time. Thanks so much.
And
Thank you.
best of luck. Best of luck. I think with the mission, Madhukar. I think it's a grand but extremely important, I think, mission and vision you've embarked on over the last few years. I've been privileged to see a little bit of it from the sidelines. So really, best of luck with it because I think it can be truly transformative.
Thank you for having me. And I must say that what gives me strength is we're actually standing on the shoulders of giants who've done some amazing work. So we're really taking it to another level. So many thanks is owed to so many other people who've actually done the hard work before we even got into the space. So I just want to absolutely acknowledge that, and so grateful for all of the work they've done.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So thank you so much.
Thank you, Madhukar.